California. They don't bring Idaho jobs. And yet now the Idaho consumer is going to have to be the one to bear the cost increases, significant cost increases, maybe doubling and quadrupling their bills.
Mr. LeBeau.
Mr. Chairman and Representative, I don't know if there was a question in there so much as a comment, but I'll go ahead and try to address the concern. We do have a Public Utilities Commission that is specifically designated to do that, to regulate how power is allocated, how the costs are allocated, and how the costs are recovered with our specific utilities. And again, there will be a representative from the power company that may also address that question. The thing is, costs are everywhere, and it's not just borne by one particular individual or anybody else. And your cost shifting is something that I think is what you're trying to get at is that existing folks are subsidizing new folks, and I don't believe that that's in fact the case. The cost of power is going up. The cost of reliability is going up because of the consumption across the board. And so if you're going to have economic development in the state, if you're going to have facilities where we can sell our raw products to in the state, you are going to have to provide power to those facilities. And if you're going to require new generation for every single new facility that comes in, that sort of throws a wrench into the proper planning for allocating that power over the long haul. I hope that addresses your question.
Representative Keeley's.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. LeBeau, and if you can't answer, maybe somebody else can, but what's the wholesale rate that the Meta data center in CUNA is paying relative to a retail rate that an average Idahoan is paying?
Mr. LeBeau.
Mr. Chairman and Representative Achilles, I do not have that data or information. I'm not entirely sure, and I wasn't involved in the contracting of that.
We do have someone from Idaho Power signed up to testify, so some of those questions might be better directed at a representative from Idaho Power. Any further questions for Mr. LeBeau today? Seeing none, thank you, Mr. LeBeau.
Thank you, sir.
Next up, Megan Ronk. Megan, I think you can kind of see some of the questions, so welcome to House State Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Megan Ronk, and I serve as the Director of Customer Experience and Economic Development for Idaho Power. And prior to being at Idaho Power, I've spent most of my career in economic development, having previously served as the Director for the Department of Commerce. And so I'm happy to address some questions related to this legislation. I think it's important for the committee to understand, as Mr. LeBeau articulated, there are already provisions in place for large users to make sure that they're paying their fair share of system costs. My team personally manages all new large users that come onto our system. And so not only are new large load users required to pay for all of the local interconnection, their substation, transmission upgrades, distribution upgrades that are required to serve their facilities, but we are also required to develop unique rate structures that we do under what are called energy services agreement or special contracts, where we have to ensure, per the Public Utilities Commission, that those users are paying their fair share of the system costs. And so whether that's their fair share of existing system costs or the new incremental generation costs that we're bringing onto our system, that is part of the rate structure that is developed for these large users. And so those contracts, while they're negotiated between Idaho Power and the customer, ultimately, they have to be presented to the Idaho Public Utilities Commission, who reviews those rates and reviews the pricing structure. And we have to do what is specifically called a no harm analysis, where we have to demonstrate that there is no harm to other Idaho Power customers. The Public Utilities Commission reviews that, and then they ultimately make the determination whether that rate structure that has been proposed ensures that that customer is paying, again, their fair share of system costs. I think it's important to remember that while we're in a time of obviously robust economic growth right now, if there were a time of a decline and a user were to leave the system, we do need to be able to ensure that we could recover some of those costs by recruiting a new large user to be able to take on some of those costs. Otherwise, they get socialized across the customer base and could actually result in some rate increases for customers. So I'll pause there. I know I'm out of time. Happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Megan. I'm sure there's questions. Representative Barbieri.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The complexity here is difficult to try and grasp in terms of questions, but it appeared that Mr. LeBeau was saying that higher retail prices by the customer are inevitable. And I'm assuming that that's driven by the necessity for the augmented wind and solar cost of those production facilities. But given the demands that these new data centers and the larger facilities that are going to be draining that, given that, how does Idaho Power in any way avoid higher prices to the consumer? And it seems like everybody's dumping this on PUC, like they're going to be able to protect that. But the bottom line is still the cost efficiency or the ability for the power generators to be, economically sufficient, or so speak to that a little bit, if you will.
Megan?
Mr. Chairman, Representative, it is complex, and I'm going to try to explain it as succinctly as I can. But first and foremost, I think it's important to acknowledge that we plan for growth, right? I mean, we look out 20 years. We're trying to forecast residential, commercial, industrial. What growth do we project in our service area? And so we are planning for that as we look at future resource needs. When you talk about really large load users, no doubt about it, that requires a unique and distinct analysis. We're trying to look at what have we already planned for, and as we look at a potential new user, how does that change the generation resources that we may need to add to our system? And so first and foremost, we're going to make sure that we can continue to serve that kind of natural organic growth that just happens over time as we've experienced growth in this state. And then as we look at the need to bring on new resources to the system, there is definitely a very prescriptive process that we have to follow to make sure that we are selecting the lowest cost resources to be able to meet that need. And again, as I mentioned, obviously it's low cost in the spirit of keeping rates low for all customers. But then as we look at new large load users, they're absolutely being assigned an incremental share of those costs to make sure that they're paying their way as a new user on the system. I don't know if I fully answered your question, but
Follow up?
Yes, if I may, Mr. Chairman. So you allude to basically amortizing the costs of establishing the producing facilities across the time. How long is that amortization? Is it a 10-year or a 20-year period? And assuming that the economy does start to, and we lose these data centers or whatever, how does the planning be affected by that potential?
Megan?
Mr. Chairman and Representative, so typically for like an individual resource, we would look at the life of that resource. So if it's a gas plant that's going to be in service 50 years versus a solar project that may only be in service 20 years. So we look at the time frame that we expect that resource to continue producing energy on our system. So that's to answer your question about timeline. The second question about what happens if these projects leave. As part of this special contract arrangement that I just mentioned that we have in place for these large users, there's definitely provisions included within those contracts that contemplate what would happen if a customer were to shutter their doors, and how would we make sure that we have protections in place, like termination payments, or that they can only reduce their demand by so many megawatts per year until the system could absorb that loss of load over time. So there are provisions in place within these unique contracts to make sure that we are protecting the interests of other customers in the event the load doesn't show up or there was a decline in unexpected ways.
Representative Honka.
Mr. Chair and Megan, I'm all for economic development and growth and jobs being created. But when I see the server farms come in and the absorbent amount of power that they consume with very little jobs, I guess my question is, how will we address that? How does the utilities address that? Because usually when I look at economic development, I see jobs being created, and I don't see many jobs being created through the server farms.
Megan?
Mr. Chairman, Representative, I guess first I would respond to that by saying, like, as a regulated utility, we have an obligation to serve. I mean, we don't get to pick who our customers are and sort of pick winners and losers. So my view on that issue is it's really up to local communities to decide what types of projects they're interested in citing in their communities. Like, what do they deem appropriate in terms of job growth and economic or capital investment, impact to other local services. I mean, to me, that decision is really driven at the local level. I think we have communities that have obviously expressed a desire for data center investment, and I would say there are communities that are not. But when it comes to us as the electric utility, I wouldn't suggest that we have the discretion to determine sort of who we should provide energy to versus who we should not.
Representative Skog.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for being here to testify. I have a letter here from Brian Searle, President of Idaho Farm Bureau Federation. I would like to read a sentence to you and just get your comment. True, not true, agree, disagree.
Is there an objection to reading from the material committee? Seeing none, go ahead.
And I'm looking at the third paragraph for those on the committee. Quote, this approach is well established. Many cooperative and municipal utilities already operate under BPA's large new capacity load policy. Additionally, the bill provides large energy consumers with the option to competitively source their power, fostering market competition and consumer choice.
Megan?
Mr. Chairman, Representative, I mean, obviously, I haven't had the opportunity to review that letter and see that statement and sort of context of the entire letter. Here's what I would say is that statement, from my perspective, fundamentally questions the structure we have in place within the state of Idaho, where we have a regulated utility system. I mean, that is suggesting deregulation and open kind of market conditions, which again, and from my perspective, that is a fundamental shift in the way we operate as a state. And I would suggest that for many, many decades, the system that we've had has been effective, and we've been able to serve customers, and we keep our costs low. We are about 20 to 30% lower than the rest of the country. So I would suggest that what we're doing today is working.
We're going to go back to Representative Barbieri.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think that given your long-term planning, do the producers see any point that generating energy cannot, as a matter of fact, meet the demand?
Megan?
Mr. Chairman, Representative, I would say that is a factor we're going to have to evaluate. Can we serve every single data center project that comes knocking on our door? Probably not. There probably gets to be a point where the system is so constrained, or the costs are so exorbitant for an individual customer to fund the upgrades that would be required to serve their project, where perhaps that becomes unsustainable. I would say that I feel comfortable with the provisions we have in place, that we can take a look at individual projects, determine the impact that they have to our system, determine the cost that new user would be required to pay to be able to connect to the system. And then we can determine on our side the appropriate timeline that we feel like that we could bring the generation on board to be able to meet their needs without impacting other Idaho Power customers.
Representative Achilles.
Yep. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Ron, so who are the top 5 commercial loads for the PUC, for Idaho Power? Did the PUC approve those? Did you go through that no harm analysis for those top 5?
Megan?
Mr. Chairman, Representative, so I'm going to just caveat this, that I do need to be slightly careful about customer confidentiality, but I will say that we have a number of these special contract arrangements that have been approved by the Idaho Public Utilities Commission, and many of them are historic longtime customers like Micron, Idaho National Laboratory, Simplot, the Dawn plant in Pocatello, the new Simplot potato processing facility in Caldwell. I would add Lamb Weston and American Falls, and then, of course, the Metadata Center in Cuna, along with the new Micron Fab facility in Pierre, Boise. So it kind of gives you a sense of the range of customers that we have that fall under those special contract arrangements.
Follow up?
Yep. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, Mr. Ron, maybe you could just help us rank order without disclosing any confidential data on rates, but I mean, where does the Meta data center relate to, the new Simplot facility?
Mr. Chairman, Representative, I don't know that I can necessarily rank order without, again, kind of crossing that line of customer confidentiality. What I will say is that, again, because the Public Utilities Commission does review these contracts, it's an open process where there's an opportunity for other customers to intervene, to be able to ask questions about the rates that are being suggested or proposed for an individual user. And so there is an opportunity as the Public Utilities Commission reviews these contracts for other customers to have input. But I would say, again, I'll reemphasize, as we develop the rates for these customers, they're paying not only their fair share of the existing system costs, which is a benefit to other customers, right? If you can take the existing system costs and you can spread it across more customers, it does have a benefit for the customer base as a whole. And then they are also responsible for paying their portion of those incremental costs.
You want to maybe refine that a little bit? What ranking are you looking for? The amount of power load that they're taking? The amount of what are you looking for?
Well, I think maybe the root issue here, Mr. Chairman and Ms. Ronk, is how these deals are being crafted and the role of the PUC in the approval process. And I think what you're hearing here, this is going to be more of a comment than a question, okay, Mr. Chairman. But I think what you're hearing here is concern that in aggregate, the PUC lacks the tools to maybe have a holistic look at what these deals look like. So I understand why Idaho Power is pursuing these, but is this good on net for all Idahoans? So, we should be able to look at, I'm assuming that the Meta data center is one of the biggest loads in the state until, the new Micron facility comes online. Is that Meta data center and the incremental cost that has on the network, on net, is that improving retail rates, right? So if we go back to your point, that on net, that should improve retail rates for the scenario that Representative Mickelson was talking about. I think that's issue number one. Issue number two that we don't think the PUC is addressing is, are these large loads good for the state? There's absolutely no question that the new Micron foundry is good for the state. The new Simplot facility is good for the state. Is a gigantic data center good for the state when there's not many jobs in there? I think these elements of the decision-making process at the PUC seem to be left out of the equation.
Would you like to respond to that, Megan? I don't know if there's a question, but would you care to respond?
Mr. Chairman, Representative, I'll do my best. And obviously, I do not represent the Idaho Public Utilities Commission, so I want to be really, really clear about that. But here's what I will say is, looking back at the timeline for the Meta Data Center project, that project initiated conversations with Idaho Power at a time when we were quite long on energy. So we had excess generation that other customers were paying for, right? I mean, it was being socialized across the entire customer base, and it was advantageous at that point in time to bring on another user that could participate in those system costs. That is not always the situation. Obviously, we're in a very different situation today with all the growth that we've seen, where we're now resource deficient. We're having to bring new resources onto our system. And so as we look at new users, we obviously have to look at them in different ways, especially from a pricing perspective, because again, we're in a different position as a system. Maybe one other thing that I would add just in response to your comment is, I guess I'll again reiterate, these are not like secret backroom deals. I mean, obviously as a new project, I mean, even the Micron Fab project was in its site selection phase. We're working with these projects to give them a sense of what types of rates they would be paying if they decided to locate that facility here within our service area. And so to the extent a project is confidential, we obviously have to maintain that confidentiality. But once that contract is negotiated, I mean, it is up and open for full public review and input. And that is evidenced today by what is happening with the Micron Fab special contract. We filed that with the Idaho Public Utilities Commission in December, and there have been customer interest groups that have weighed in and offered their feedback to the commission, in which will be an open process where they can request discovery about how rates were developed. They have an opportunity to add comments and even have public testimony. And so I guess I would argue that it is not a secret process. It is actually the opposite. It is quite open and transparent.
Representative Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Ronk, I have two questions, but my first one is just on a brief search on the internet. I see that the minimum wholesale rate is $3.49 and the average retail is $10.97. Can you tell me, is that accurate numbers? A low of 3.49 for wholesale or these bigger projects, and the average for consumers of 10.9?
Megan?
Mr. Chairman and Representative, I don't know the source of that information, and so I would be, I wouldn't be in a position to comment on that. I don't think. I'd be happy to follow up with you afterwards.
Just on that, would you have an idea of what the rates are for a residential customer versus a large industrial customer?
Mr. Chairman, I don't have that information off the top of my head. Again,
Okay.
I can provide that to you as follow up afterwards.
Certainly. Follow up.
Thank you. Just a comment, this is BPA's minimum rate, so I'm assuming it's pretty close, but I just am unsure. My second question is, you say that these contracts and that are open to the public and that, and I'm just wondering, my big question is, how much does politics play in this? As you know, the executive branch picks the PUC members. PUC members are making decisions. Are there standards at a federal level that come in that require certain things of our PUC, or is this being done under a political umbrella?
Megan?
Mr. Chairman, Representative, I mean, all I can speak to is the way that we manage projects from an Idaho Power perspective. I mean, we treat all customers the same. I mean, on our side, there is no politics involved, and I would certainly hate to speculate on any sort of political influence on the PUC. I don't have any insight into that.
Thank you.
Any further questions for Megan?
Yes.
Really? You have had your coffee this morning, haven't you?
Sorry, Mr.
I was
Chair.
looking at this side of the room because it's all been this side of the room today.
Apologize, Mr. Chair.
All right. No, you're doing just fine.
I'm trying to get to the heart of this, and maybe this helps. I don't know. Would there be any scenario wherein the energy producer, the project developer, the PUC, would conclude that the new facility has to begin to generate a portion of the new energy demand? And is it the point of opposing this legislation is to try and keep that decision making within the PUC and the contractual relationship between the parties?
Megan?
Mr. Chairman and Representative, and of course, happy to take the questions. This is my only time probably testifying at the legislature this year, so I'm excited I get to be here for a
you're
while.
have to ask Malman for a spa day tomorrow.
If I understand your question correctly, so I mean the crux of the issue, from at least from my perspective, is it's not so much securing the generation that's. I mean, it's a challenge, right? We have to figure out where it's going to go, what developers we're going to work with, how we're going to construct it, what the timeline is. But I mean, those issues are solvable with time and money. I mean, especially if the customer is funding their both system costs and incremental costs. So I don't know that I'm totally answering your question or that I understood it completely. Okay.
It must have been the chairman's comment about a spa day got you out of here. All right. Any further questions for Megan? Representative Hosteller.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for a quick question.
Certainly.
Thank you, Mrs. Ronk. This is kind of a more general question. In regard to, say, residential versus agriculture versus data centers, industrial, is there a rate difference since kilowatts breakdown I know you said you kind of treat everybody equally in a broader sense, but what is the rate breakdown? Are citizens paying more than these data centers versus agriculture? Do you know?
Megan?
Mr. Chairman, Representative, there are different rates for different rate classes, and I don't have that information with me here today. But here's what I will say is the opportunity to look at sort of which customer class pays sort of what percentage of the overall system cost is what is contemplated in what we call a general rate case. So every so often, investor-owned utilities will go in front of the Idaho Public Utilities Commission. We open up our books. We describe, the costs that are necessary to operate the system, and there is a very thorough and again public process where that determination of sort of which customer classes are paying kind of what percentage of the overall system costs is contemplated in those moments. And again, those are the opportunities when different customer interest groups, weigh in, and same with these special contracts. Those are also up for evaluation where the commission is looking at residential versus commercial versus industrial versus these large special contract customers. And there's an open case that happens where there's a lot of input and dialogue, and ultimately the PUC sort of makes determinations on the appropriate assignment of those costs amongst different customer classes.
Follow up?
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. Great answer. Is there a place we can find solid answers in regard to that?
Megan?
Mr. Chairman, yes. We have all of that information broken down by cost per customer class. I just don't happen to have that today, but I can make sure that we immediately follow up with that information.
Thank you. Any further questions for Megan? Seeing none, thank you for your testimony today. That's all I have signed up in person today. I've got 3 virtual. Is there anyone in the audience today that would like to testify on House Bill 395? Go ahead. State your name, who you represent. You'll have 2 minutes today for public testimony.
Hi there. Sorry, I thought I'd have a little more time to prepare. So my name is Justine Kravanek. I am president of the Rural Community Advocates Group. We hope to have more people here to testify, but short notice. We are the ones that kind of head fronted the Savion Solar Farm out there near Kuna. I've had great relationship with Megan Ronk, actually met with her last month, and wonderful person. But after hearing and speaking, some of the same concerns kind of come up. So when I met with her last month, my big question was, what's the fair share that's negotiated? What's Meta paying? What's, the consumer rate? She had the exact same answer. Sorry, Megan. And I did not get a follow-up with those answers. So definitely make sure that you get those answers because I think it's pretty important. And I find it odd that it's not easier to access that data. I also just wanted to put some perspective in place, that this bill protects Idaho families, farmers, and small business owners from being priced out of our power supply, just like many that are already being priced out of our housing. I'm also a realtor, so definitely dealing with that. Let's just put something in perspective. 1 megawatt of power can serve around 700 homes. Some of the new high demand facilities are projected to use 200 to 300 megawatts or more. That's enough power to power over 200,000 homes, which is more than all the households in Ada and Canyon counties combined. So where will the rest of us get our power? The answer is new generation. More solar farms, more wind turbines. And where do those go? On our farmland. Productive, valuable farmland that is part of Idaho's identity and economy. We know that it's not producing jobs to have all this. It's very short term. I've got family that work at the Meta facility. They just laid off 150 electricians. Are they moving to Micron? I don't know, but just things to consider. We want to protect Idahoans, make sure that companies creating massive energy demand are the ones paying for it.
I need you to wrap it up. Your time's expired.
Not our families, not our farmers, and not our retirees on fixed incomes.
Any questions for Justine? Representative Barbieri.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I understand your position to say that the production, the building of these facilities does not produce enough for the economy to offset the cost that the ratepayers are going to be paying.
No way.
Any further questions? Representative Pohanka.
Just a comment, Chairman, and that you can find the rates on the Idaho Public Utilities Commission, and it's broke out for residential, commercial, and industrial. If anyone's interested.
For Meta
Just a comment.
specifically in those contracts?
I don't know about the contracts, but it will show residential rates, commercial and industrial. So you'll know per kilowatt hour what you pay.
Representative,
So just information.
Just for your edification, the chairman is going to ask of Idaho Power, demand that they get those rates to the committee. And I want your contact information because we will forward those on to you so you get them as well. So Megan, I know you can get those for us, and I would appreciate the rates as well as some of the information that the committee's asked about. Anyone else in the audience want to testify today on House Bill 395? Yes, sir. I'm sorry, the way this works when we don't have people sign up is Megan just kind of gets to be the star of the show, and her name's always up there. So state your name and who you represent today. You have 2 minutes for public testimony.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. My name is Tom Carter, and I'm with Rocky Mountain Power, and I'm glad to be up here today. Ms. Ronk talked about most of the things I wanted to talk about, but I do think there's a fundamental question that the legislature needs to ask, the state needs to ask, and that is, do we want these loads in our state? And I think that is a good question. I do think that 10 megawatts might be too low of a number as we contemplate this, right? I look at from a investor-owned utility, a regulated utility mindset, as Megan mentioned, we do plan for regular incremental growth, 5%, 6%, 7% growth every year, and we look out 20 years. What we're seeing with some of this growth or some of these requests is 1,000% growth, 100% growth, or more, right? Like a gigawatt worth of generation or of load, and that is a big request. And so, yes, do we believe the cost should follow the cost causer? Absolutely, we do. But we are concerned, and we do believe, and we oppose this legislation because we do think that this currently is unnecessary because Idaho already has a very good process in place and protects the company, protects the customers, most importantly, and because of tariffs that are already in place in Idaho, as they were already discussed. And so, as we are ensuring that costs follow cost causers, as we use the system that is already in place to ensure that the Public Utilities Commission will safeguard our customers, that I think is a place to go. And so that is my testimony. I'm happy to pause and provide any questions for the committee, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Are there questions? Representative Boyle.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sir, you mentioned that you think 10 megawatts is too low. What would you suggest?
My guess, Mr. Chairman, Representative Boyle, I think that somewhere between 50 and 100 megawatts would be a good place to start. Granted, we have large customers in the 200 that we've created special contracts with in the 200 megawatt range, and we think that that is important to recognize that. But I think that if you want to look at a 50 to 100 megawatt range that are aggregated, that I think is a good place to go. But also, I think that we need to make sure we're not pricing out or ensuring that the loads that bring real economic development to the state aren't being harmed. And I think that's the fundamental question. Do those that bring jobs are able to find a way to bring their loads and work with the investor-owned utilities to use their load position properly.
Representative Skog.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is an area I don't often deal with. In fact, not at all in my legislation work. Bottom line is, for me, does this bill, if it passes into law, cause harm? And if so, to whom and how?
Tom?
Mr. Chairman, Representative, I think that's a really great question. I think we're still trying to wrap our arms around it. I think that our concern is that we don't know. At least that's my read, and I'm sorry I haven't dug too deeply into the legislation. I think there are concerns about could it cause harm to current customers because it does not talk necessarily about how transmission can be used and if transmission rights could be socialized amongst the current rate base. That's something that is concerning to us. We want to make sure that if all costs are going to be sent to the cost causer, we have to have a real in-depth conversation about how we, through the greatest extent by which FERC would allow, we direct those costs to the cost causer. I think those are really complex questions that are not answered in this legislation. And so before we move something forward, we have to make sure that we're hitting every single element to directly assign costs.
Thank you, Tom. Further questions? Seeing none, we're going to move to virtual testimony. Eric Olson. What? Welcome, Eric.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the opportunity to testify here today remotely. I represent the Idaho Irrigation Pumpers Association. I've practiced before the Idaho Public Utilities Commission for almost 20 years now. We represent Idaho irrigation pumpers who pump irrigation water from the ground and use lots of electricity. We're probably, as far as a combined group, second or third, we're probably the third largest customer group and user of power. And so this is very important to us. The irrigation pumpers as a group, their growth on the system has been relatively flat for the last 10 to 15 years. There's no new land being put in production. Similarly, other customer classes like the industrial customers of Idaho Power are similarly flat. What we are facing here right now is exponential growth on Idaho Power system. It is traced directly to these new large loads, specifically Meta, Micron, and other potential data centers. As this last person that testified for Rocky Mountain Power, that is like 100, 200% growth on the system. Those costs are going to get socialized across the whole customer classes. And the impact of this will be felt on the everyday ratepayer, the retirees, those on fixed incomes, as well as the farmers, where those who pump water, the cost of electricity is becoming an ever larger percentage of their production costs, and more or less, we will be subsidizing these new large loads that are coming to the state unless we have growth pay for itself. And
Eric, I'm going to need you to wrap up.
Is all that's about. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there questions for Eric today? Representative Mickelson.
Yes, Eric and Mr. Chairman, can you tell us how much it costs for you guys to go through a rate case and how often you're seeing these rate cases?
Eric?
Typically, the cost for the irrigators to go through a rate case is $60,000 to $80,000. In my time and also our expert witness time, right now we just finished general rate cases with Idaho Power and Rocky Mountain Power. Idaho Power just in 2024 spent about an additional $2 billion that they're seeking recovery from. Their integrated resource plan and their projections, based on my understanding, they're going to be spending about $1 billion per year to try to meet this new potential load growth. And it is going to be borne and socialized across all customer classes unless we have these business and industrial concerns pay for their fair share of that growth, because they are causing it.
Any further questions for Eric? Seeing none, thank you, Eric. Next up, Andrew Mickelson.
Before Andrew testifies, I'm just going to declare a Rule 80 there.
Oh, this will be fun then. Eric, are you there? Or Andrew?
Andrew's here.
Okay, Mom just wanted to make sure you're working today, so I'm assuming that's why you're zooming in.
Yeah, and that's why I'm in work clothes here. I don't know what the
Smart man.
camera, but I apologize.
Go ahead.
Really quick, Andrew Mickelson. I'm a farmer. I'm also part of Idaho Irrigators and Pumpers, which Eric just spoke about as well. We currently spend about $2.5 million on power annually, mainly with Rocky Mountain Power, with others as well, and we're already seeing a 17% increase this year. We talked about how ag is not really increasing, how it's not changing, and it's hard for us when we keep seeing all of these costs keep going up for us and up for us and up for us. When I search for the lowest cost for data centers in the nation, it's Idaho. Over and over again. Ag's paying twice as much. Retail's probably 3 to 4 times as much. And so I think that we have to find a way to appropriately address these additional costs on the system. You know, they talk about it being spread out. However, it doesn't need to be spread out. It needs to make other customer classes power cheaper. Unless it's doing that, it's dragging down the system. We just have to keep being competitive here. We need to reward the people that have been a part of the systems for years and years and years that have built it up and not be putting the power costs onto them. Thank you, and I stand for questions.
Thank you, Andrew. Are there questions for Andrew? Andrew, Chairman's got a question. Are you seeing double-digit rate increases on a frequent basis?
So they came this year and asked, sorry, Chairman, they came this year and I believe it was a 28% increase that they asked for. We got it down to the 17%. And it's tied up for 2 years, but we expect when the 2 years are up, they're going to come back and ask again for another double-digit increase. It's happening. We're seeing the power costs getting pushed up and in a drastic way.
Wow. Okay. Thank you very much for your testimony. I'll let you get back to work. Taylor Grant.
Good afternoon, committee.
Well, it's still the morning here. I don't know where you're at, Taylor.
Down in Denver, actually, so it's still morning here.
All right. Okay.
Thank you very much for your time. I represent Grant 40 Farms. We farm down in the south central part of Idaho. We operate across about 40,000 irrigated acres. We employ up to about 300 people at peak season. This bill we are in favor of. Really, the focus of the bill is to insulate generations of Idahoans and families and their businesses, and to maintain their cost of living and cost of doing business. Idahoans will be subsidizing business that may not be bringing a tremendous amount of economic value in terms of job growth if this bill or controls aren't put into place. California is also doing similar actions. They have a Senate Bill 57 that they're implementing. They're trying to roll back and claw back some of the costs that have been incurred to their customers. Washington in 2018 also put in place what they call the evolving industry rate for larger power users, also recognizing that the power cost is substantial. New York in 2018, the residents saw about a $10 hike per month, and so they had to claw that back as well back in 2018. And so this bill is getting ahead of much more substantial growth. It's going to be much harder to try and claw back the costs later on once they're incurred and realized by the ratepayers. Really, on the farm, we are already paying and shutting pivots off and irrigation systems off during peak demand. With these systems, there is no peak demand turnoff. They run 24/7. So we are in favor and appreciate your time and stand for questions.
Thank you, Taylor. Are there questions for Taylor? Seeing none, thank you for your testimony today. Representative Garner will give you a couple of minutes to wrap up here, and then we'll take action on the legislation today.
Thank you, Chairman Crane and committee. I appreciate you hearing this bill today, so I will be short. I don't believe that this bill will stifle growth. I think it just makes growth pay for growth. Some of the things to remember as you're deciding what to do with House Bill 395, the BPA for many years, the for decades has required 22 municipalities and cooperatives in Idaho to abide by this very rule that is being proposed, anything over 10 megawatts. Many of our surrounding states provide for large load customers to access competitive wholesale suppliers for new energy. Local utilities are made whole because they get paid for their distribution, wheeling, etc., that is set by the PUC. This bill brings competition to the market for large commercial users and protects existing users that have already paid for current system. The monopolistic practices have limited competition for new large load sophisticated customers to be able to have competitive prices. With this, I ask you to move House Bill 395 on to the floor with due pass recommendation.
Thank you, Representative Garner. Are there questions for Representative Garner? Seeing none. Oh, Representative Alfieri.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Garner. Some of the testimony is saying that the load limit here that you have at 10 megawatts is too low. It's been suggested that you'd be up around 100 megawatts. What are your thoughts on that?
Chairman Crane, Representative Alfieri, I would ask you to remember that the 10 megawatts is about 7,000 residents, which are your constituents. And I think Idaho Power said it best when they said that these costs are socialized across the customer base.
Any further questions? Seeing none, House Bill 395 is properly before the committee. Representative Barbieri.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I find it interesting how we're balancing so many different things in most of our decisions. I think there is some weight to the question of whether this 10 megawatt demand is too low. For other reasons, I think the fact that the PUC is part of this process, I move that we send House Bill 395 to the amending order so that we can address, maybe tie some of the questions that we have with return on investment, jobs, and economic development, and take a look at that. So that's my motion.
Motion is to send House Bill 395 to general orders. Is there discussion on the motion or further motions? Representative Keeley's.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, just a comment on the motion, if I may.
Certainly.
So first of all, I really appreciate Representative Garner and Representative Gannon bringing this. This is an important conversation. I am concerned that our current system, we're perpetuating concentrated market power monopolies. We've got our natural monopoly in Idaho Power that's regulated, but through this process, they're inadvertently perpetuating big tech monopolies like Meta. And Meta's using that market power to get preferential rates and load Idaho Power system that we're all paying for. We had a rate increase for all consumers of 3.7% in January. As we heard, Ag's paying more. And clearly Meta was rate shopping when they put their data center here. They could have put it anywhere. My concern with this bill and why I support sending it to general orders is that Micron would be impacted by this. Micron doesn't have that flexibility. They didn't have a choice about where they put their new foundry. It had to be here. It had to be next to their facilities. So we're impacting, a critical company like Micron when we're trying to mitigate, I think, the damage from a company like Meta. So I also think there's a clear message here to other companies thinking they can rate shop and build their data center in Idaho that we're not going to tolerate it. So support this motion to send to general orders. I think we do some cleanup on this bill and we push it forward.
Thank you, Representative Keeley. Representative Scott and Representative Dygart. Just bear in mind, folks, we've got to be on the floor in 30 minutes.
I just wanted to share that this reminds me a lot of urban renewal districts. You put in a big development and you give them a tax break and everyone else picks up the tab. And that's exactly what I think we're doing. And I'd like to make a substitute motion to send to the floor with a due pass recommendation.
Substitute motion to send 395 to the floor with a due pass recommendation. Representative Dygart.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I can't support the Senate to floor with the due pass, and I wonder if the Senate to the general or to the general orders will solve the problems we have here. I really appreciate what the good Representative Gardner is doing here. We need to protect our residential ratepayers, no doubt, and the same with our agricultural ratepayers. But this will become a huge conversation with lots and lots of stakeholders. And this has got my full attention because in District 23, that's where Meta is. That's where the new data center's coming. We have Gateway West coming through there.
They're trying to put a new battery complex in out at Hemingway, and they're trying to do some geothermal out in Hawaii County. So this is certainly a big topic for me. But we're also talking about other sustainable growth practices that we got to include that we've heard in other committees. We've got the water implications, we got the land use, we got the using farm ground, and plus the power. And I fully agree. Sometimes we're putting the cart before the horse. We've got counties or different new.
Diger, any further discussion on the motion? Substitute motion is to send House Bill 395 to the floor with a due pass recommendation. All in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, nay? Nay. Motion is carried. It will be sent to the floor with a due pass recommendation. Committee will now consideration House Bill 344. The intent with 344 is to have a hearing on 344 to hold it and introduce and send to the second reading RS 32659. Representatives